There's a hurt you keep calling healed, and it isn't. You say it with conviction whenever someone asks. Already dealt with it. Long over. Years ago now. And most days you almost believe that. But there's a specific moment, always some version of the same one, where the certainty comes apart on its own. The name comes up in some unrelated conversation, mentioned in passing by someone who has no idea what that name means to you, and something tightens in your chest before you've decided anything. Not a memory, a reaction. The body gets there first. It always gets there first. And only afterward does the mind scramble to explain what it just felt. Or maybe it's an old photo, found by accident while you were looking for something else. You stop, look longer than you meant to, and what comes up isn't anger. Or not only anger, it's a messier mix of things you never had names for. There's a question you never asked, because nobody told you it needed asking. The hurt you carry from what someone else did to you, and the hurt you carry from what you did, or allowed, or only understood too late, are two different things. Odds are you've never separated one from the other, which might be exactly why neither one has actually ended. You call it healed because you stopped crying, because you can hear the name now without leaving the room, because you built a routine around the hole and learned to walk near it without falling in. But healing isn't learning to root around something. It's not having something to root around anymore. And if you're honest with yourself, you already know the difference, even if you've never said it out loud, not even to yourself. There's a word people throw around like it's simple: forgiveness. As if you could just decide one morning that it won't hurt anymore, and that's that. Forgiven, done. Nobody ever taught you that forgiveness has structure, stages. One part that's about the other person, and a bigger part, the part almost everyone avoids, that's about you. And as long as nobody names those parts, you stay stuck repeating the same pain in different outfits, thinking it's resolved just because you stopped talking about it out loud. The problem was never your inability to let go. The problem is nobody ever showed you the actual path. So you tried to improvise one on your own, alone, with a wound that needed a method, not willpower. 5 steps from men who thought about this 2,000 years ago with a clarity that still cuts sharper than anything you'll find in a self-help feed today. And the first one doesn't start with forgiving anyone. It starts somewhere smaller and somewhere harder than it sounds. You've been telling this story for years. Always the same way, nearly word for word by now. Rehearsed enough that you barely notice you're doing it anymore, whether you're telling it to someone else or just to yourself. And every time you tell it, something gets heavier, not lighter, because what you're repeating isn't quite what happened. It's the interpretation of what happened, seasoned year after year, with everything you felt afterward, everything you assumed about the other person's intentions, everything your mind had to invent to make the pain make sense. The fact itself was usually small. A sentence said, a choice major silence, exactly when you need a word. That's the fact. Everything else, the cruel intention you assigned, the meaning you decided it carried about your worth, the story that this person always knew the damage they were doing, that isn't fact. That's the narrative you built around the fact, one you've been retelling so long you can't separate the two anymore. Epictetus wrote that people aren't disturbed by things themselves, but by the opinions they hold about them. Few places does that idea sting more than an old wound. The event is over. It doesn't exist anymore, except as memory. What's still alive, what's still hurting you daily, is the interpretation you've chosen to keep breathing. That doesn't mean what happened wasn't real, or didn't genuinely hurt. It means there are 2 layers stacked where you only see one. And as long as you don't separate what actually happened from the story you built on top of it, you're fighting an opponent you partly invented, one that will never stop growing because you keep feeding it. A simple exercise, done with brutal honesty. Write down what happened in one sentence. Just the fact. No adjectives, no they signed intent. No verdict on the person's character. Then, next to it, write the story you tell about that fact. Everything you've added on over the years. Look at the gap between the two. Most of the time, that gap is where the real weight lives. Far more than in the fact itself. Take a common enough hurt, the kind almost everyone's carried in some form. The fact might be nothing more than this. She ended things over text. No explanation. On a Sunday night. That's the entire fact. Verifiable. No room for interpretation. The story you built around it, over the following months, was probably much bigger. She never really loved me. She'd been planning this for weeks, while pretending everything was fine. She wanted to hurt me in the most cowardly way possible. None of those are facts. They're interpretations. Some plausible, none proven. Built because the pain needed a reason and went looking for one anywhere it could find it. You don't need to rewrite the past. You need to stop feeding it a bigger story than it earned. And there's a second layer underneath all this, more hidden, that keeps the process stuck even after you've understood the first part. You think forgiving means saying it was okay, which is exactly why you resist, without realizing you're resisting a wrong idea, not the act itself. Because forgiveness, the way you picked it up without meaning to, sounds like erasing what happened, pretending it didn't hurt, handing a free pass to whoever hurt you, as if none of it mattered. And some part of you, rightly, refuses to do that, because it did hurt, because it was real, because it deserves to be recognized as what it was, not swept under a rug of good intentions. But forgiveness was never about that. Marcus Aurelius wrote, almost daily, about dealing with people who acted badly, who erred, who caused harm, and never once suggested that pretending the harm hadn't happened was part of the deal. He named the wrong plainly, in full, and still chose not to carry poison because of it. Those two things sat together without contradiction in his mind, and they can sit together in yours too, even if nobody ever showed you how. Approving means saying what happened was right. Forgiving means deciding you won't let what happened run what you feel today. Those are completely different things, and confusing them is probably the biggest silent block in the whole process. You can believe what someone did was wrong. Keep believing that for the rest of your life, if that's the case, and still set down the weight you're carrying inside. One doesn't cancel the other. Keeping them separate, clearly, is what unsticks the part that's been stuck. There's a sentence that tests this. What happened was wrong, and I choose not to carry the weight of it anymore. Notice there's no contradiction there. Just truth, said in two parts, neither one needing to erase the other. You don't need to lie to yourself and say it's fine. You just need to stop letting what isn't fine live inside you, for free. But there's a trap even quieter than that one, the kind that stalls the whole process for years, without you noticing, because it feels reasonable, feels almost fair. You're waiting on an apology that might never come, somewhere. Without ever saying it out loud, you decided you'll only feel free once the other person acknowledges what they did. Once they call or write, or look you in the eye and admit it in exactly the right words. The ones you've imagined so many times in your head, alone, with them never knowing about the scene you kept writing and rewriting. And while that hasn't happened, you wait, and the waiting turns into a cell nobody locked except you. If you watched the video on people who drain your energy, you'll recognize a similar pattern here, from a different angle. Because handing your emotional relief over to someone else, waiting for them to do something before you can finally feel okay, is the same architecture as depending on someone else's behavior just to breathe easy. Except here the waiting has a more respectable name. It's called justice. It's still a cell. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that sounds simple until you actually try to live it. How much time is saved, he said, by the one who stops watching what their neighbor said, or did, or thought, and looks only at what they themselves need to do to make it just and right. He wasn't talking about ignoring real harm. He was talking about no longer anchoring your peace to something entirely outside your control, which is another person's conscience and will. The person who hurt you might never apologize, might never own what they did, might even, and this happens more often than people admit, believe you're the one who overreacted. None of that is under your command, and none of it can keep being the condition for your freedom. That doesn't mean an apology wouldn't matter if it came. It means you stop needing it in order to move forward. That distinction is where all your leverage on this point actually lives. Notice the math you're running without realizing it. You're betting your peace today, guaranteed, real, available right now. against the uncertain chance of an apology that might never arrive, from someone who might not even recognize what they did wrong. It's a bad bet, made daily, without you noticing you're even in the game. The only way out is to stop playing, not to win the hand. One question that reorganizes everything. Am I going to keep waiting for something that might never arrive? Or am I going to set this weight down regardless of what the other person's conscience decides to do with it? The answer changes everything, and only you can give it, because no one else has access to what you're actually waiting on inside. Waiting on an apology to feel free is handing the key to your own door to someone who might never come back to use it. But everything up to this point has been about the hurt you carry from the outside in. There's a second hurt, usually heavier, that you carry from the inside out, and almost nobody talks about it with the same care. You still haven't forgiven who you were back then, the decision you made without thinking it through, the time you stayed quiet when you should have spoken, the time you trusted someone you shouldn't have, or doubted someone who deserved more credit. The mistake that looks obvious now, so obvious you can't understand how you missed it then, and because you can't understand it, you keep punishing yourself for it, with a severity you'd probably never apply to anyone but yourself. But there's a detail you're ignoring every time you judge that earlier version of yourself. You're using information you only have today to convict a decision made with the information you had then. That isn't justice. It's a rigged trial, one no actual court would allow, and you run it against yourself constantly without noticing the rigging. Seneca wrote about this with a clarity that still lands uncomfortably today. He said we all do things we later regret, and that no one, no matter how wise they think themselves, is exempt from that. Recognizing this, for him, wasn't an excuse for the mistake. It was the honest recognition that judging the past through the eyes of the present is a subtle form of cruelty against yourself, dressed up as moral rigor. The earlier version of you didn't have what you have now, didn't have this experience, this pain that taught what it taught, this clarity that only ever comes after, the way it always does. That version did what it could, with what it had available in that exact moment, and continuing to punish that version years later, using knowledge that only exists because that mistake happened, is asking it to have known something you only know now, precisely because of what it lived through. An honesty exercise. Write down, in a few sentences, what you knew, felt, and feared in that moment, without using any information that came later. Look at the decision from inside that context, not from outside it with today's eyes. More often than not, the decision that felt unforgivable starts to make a different kind of sense. The sense of someone doing the best they could with what they had, not the sense of someone acting out of malice or stupidity. Maybe you keep returning to the time you stayed in a relationship you already knew wasn't right for too long. It looks obvious now that you should have left sooner. But back then you didn't have today's clarity. You had a fear of being alone. A whole childhood teaching you that love proves itself by staying. Real hope that it might still change. The person who stayed wasn't weak or foolish. They were someone trying to survive with the emotional tools available to them at that moment. Tools that weren't the ones you have now, after living through exactly what taught you to have more. You don't need to approve of what you did. You need to stop judging who you were with information that person never had. If you watched the video on carrying other people's weight, you already know how to spot when a burden doesn't belong to you. What you might not have noticed yet is that sometimes the weight you're carrying wrongly is your own. An earlier version of yourself you keep locked in a cell you built and keep relocking every single day. And even after doing all of this, separating fact from story, understanding that forgiving isn't approving, releasing the weight for an apology that might never come, forgiving the version of you from back then, there's one last truth nobody told you, and it changes everything about how you live what comes next. The hurt can come back, and that doesn't mean you failed. You'll do all of this. Feel real, genuine relief. Maybe even believe you've finally turned the page for good. And then, months later, maybe years later, something will bring that tightness back on some ordinary day without warning. And the first reaction, almost automatic, will be to assume the whole process didn't work, that you're back at square one. That maybe you never really forgave at all, because if you had, this wouldn't still hurt. That conclusion is exactly what stops most people from continuing, because they treat forgiveness as a single event, a line you cross once. And when the pain resurfaces, they read it as proof of failure, when it's really just proof that they're human. Marcus Aurelius finished and restarted the same self-examination almost every day, not because he failed every day, but because he knew the mind doesn't get organized once and stay that way forever. It has to be reorganized again and again, patiently, without drama every time it slips. What he called retreating into himself wasn't a final destination. It was a repeated practice, done today and tomorrow and the day after, as many times as it took. Forgiveness works the same way. It isn't a door you walk through once and leave behind for good. It's a choice that sometimes needs making again, the second time the pain shows up, and the third, each time a little faster, a little lighter, a little less frightening, until one day you notice the pain still visits, but it doesn't live there anymore. When the hurt comes back, and it probably will, that's not the moment to decide none of it mattered. That's the moment to make the choice again. I've already separated the fact from the story. I already understand forgiving isn't approving. I already released the wait for an apology. I already understand the version of me who made that decision. And I choose, again, not to carry this weight today. You don't need to forgive once and for all. You just need to be willing to choose it again, every time it's necessary, without punishing yourself for needing to choose again. Look at the 5 steps together now, not separately. None of them ask you to lie about what you felt. None of them ask you to say it's fine when it isn't. None of them ask the other person to do anything before you're allowed to move on. Separate the fact from the story. Understand that forgiving isn't approving. Stop waiting on an apology that might never come. Forgive who you were, given what that person knew then. Accept that the hurt can come back without meaning you failed. 5 moves that don't change the past, because nobody can change the past. They change how you carry what's left of it. And that shift, on its own, is more freedom than most people ever experience in a lifetime spent carrying hurts they never learned to name, let alone put down. Forgiveness was never about the other person deserving it. It was always about you deserving rest. Of the 5 steps, there's one you already know, right now, you need to start with. Write just one word in the comments. Free. If that's what you felt reading this, that word already says everything that needs saying, without you having to explain to anyone what you were carrying or who it was from. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the best revenge is not to become like the one who wronged you. You don't need to become like them. You just need to finally stop carrying what isn't yours anymore. Production notes structure. An estimated timing cold open 0 o'clock to 1:40. 3 movements in the first 30 seconds.